broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy New Year to everyone, and hope that during the break you're able to at least spend some time and enjoy, as possible, the opportunity to be with family and friends. My name is Len Dumas, Executive Director for the Northern California section of the PGA. And, many thanks are owed to our production team, particularly my colleague, Tom Addis, the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, the Southern California PGA, Nikki Gatch, the Assistant Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Southern California PGA, Jeff Johnson, Bryce Seaver, and Caitlin Doyle here in Northern California for being able to retool, if you will, and get us back on the air, so to speak, in light of recent events, particularly over the past 3 or 4 weeks. So we greatly appreciate their readiness, and we continue, to live in an ever-changing landscape and keeping up with everything that's happened. To our speakers as well, we're grateful for the continuing support of our chat mission. And today we have Crystalline Lee, an associate attorney in the Irvine office of the national firm of Troutman Pepper, to lead us in understanding the new employer requirements of COVID-19 from both the state of California and Cal OSHA. Greg Raleigh. Greg is a member of the Northern California section, financial advisor with Waddell & Reed, and Greg was with us early on in March, April, and May of this year. Greg is in Reno to update us on the second round of the payroll protection plan. And of course, Craig Kessler, Craig, our Director of Government Affairs for the Southern California Golf Association, and Kevin Fitzgerald, Assistant Governmental Affairs Director for the Southern California Golf Association. We're grateful, and Tom and I talk about this quite a bit, that our industry continues to thrive in the midst of the pandemic and certainly of the unfortunate national events of this week. We restate our thanks to all of our colleagues and industry partners, both here in the state of California, the state of Nevada, and nationally, and to a large extent internationally, because it's the adherence to the protocols and the rules and regulations of our national, state, and local bodies that have allowed us to continue to thrive, even though things are kind of messy all around us. So let's get started. We've got a full calendar this morning. I'd like to introduce our Northern California PGA President, Didi Moriarty. Didi?
Thanks, Len. Good morning, Len. Good morning, Tom. Basically, just want to wish everybody a very happy and prosperous New Year. It seems like when we don't meet for a couple of weeks, we have these transformational events in society, and I'm just looking forward to the day where it's nothing but good news. So sending special prayers to Southern California. Keep vigilant, stay inside as much as you can, and let's keep golf safe and a haven for everybody. So back to you, Len.
Thank you, Didi. And now to Tom. Tom, to introduce the Southern California team, please. Tom, can't hear you. Please check.
Yep, sorry about that.
Here we go.
My cursor there, but forgot to click it. Anyway, sorry for that, and Happy New Year to everybody. It's great to be starting another series of California Nevada PGA chats for 21. Looking forward to 21, and hopefully with vaccines out and new health ways, hopefully we'll have a much safer and a much healthier 21. I'd like to thank everybody for being here again. I'd like to thank at the start Mike Witten, who's a good friend of mine, an attorney with Troutman Pepper, who has been very meaningful to bringing Caitlin with us today, and we appreciate that. And appreciate the Southern California section. Robin Shelton is our new president. Robin's unable to make it today, but we do have Tony Latendre, our immediate past president, honorary president, who would like to say a few words.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Len, and Happy New Year, everybody. Just wanted to take a minute to say hello and Happy New Year. And, And I guess I want to echo Dee Dee's sentiment in saying that we just got to be cautious and make sure we're making smart decisions. I'm noticing more and more around my club, people are starting to get a little bit more and more restless. And I'm sure you're experiencing the same thing at your clubs, whether it be private or public. People are getting a little restless with all the rules, but it's important that we stay vigilant and make sure that we follow all these policies so that golf can remain open. I think that's very important because it affects us all. So as much as we may want to fall into that trap of being frustrated with this ongoing pandemic, that we need to make sure that we're staying vigilant and following all the rules so that golf stays off the radar and we can all continue our livelihood. So I just want to say that, and Happy New Year, and I'm sure that's what Robin would say as well, and so I try to speak on behalf of him in his absence. So Happy New Year, everybody.
Thanks, Tony. And I want to make a correction. I said Catalin, and Crystalline is what I meant to say, and I apologize for that. One thing is we had a couple of you when we finished our chat right before the holidays to ask us to continue, and especially with the new PPP guidelines, as well as the vaccination out and other important areas, we felt it very important to continue these chats. Right now, we're going to schedule at least every Friday, and we'll get back into the groove, and we'll see whether or not we need to continue that schedule or go back to an every other Friday, or when needed, so to speak, doing these chats. So with that, again, Tony, thank you. Dee Dee, thank you. And everyone else, Nikki and Bryce and Caitlin and everybody, thanks so much. Here we go, Lynn. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Tom, and everyone. And we'd like to introduce, to get started this morning, Crystalline Lee. And Crystalline is an associate of the Troutman Pepper firm in the Irvine office of Southern California. Crystalline is a graduate of UCLA and the Chapman University Fowler School of Law. Crystalline represents business and employment disputes and litigation before various government agencies in state and federal court arbitration and pre-litigation resolution. Crystalline has assumed an active role in advising California clients on COVID-19 related employment practices and issues, including workplace safety, which is Cal OSHA, family and sick leave management, and quarantine and shelter in place orders. Crystalline was recognized as Best Lawyers, One to Watch for Labor and Employment Law and Management for 2021. She was also selected as an Academy Fellow in 2016 and 17 for the National Employment Law Council, which consists of a group of 25 national attorneys recognized for demonstrated excellence in management, side labor, and employment law. And she also remains an active member of the National Employment Law Council. Most recently, in September of 2020, authored "The California Governor Expands COVID-19 Protections for California Employees and Imposes Additional Requirements on California Employers." So if I kept reading Crystalline's accomplishments and such, we would run out of time. So let me turn it over to her. Crystalline, thank you so much for taking your time this morning, be willing to share your expertise on the ever-changing employment landscape of California in itself, even without COVID. But we've got some in front of us, as you mentioned in your email, AB 65, the Infection Prevention Requirements, Senate Bill 1159, and then, of course, the Cal OSHA Emergency Standards Temporary. So again, Crystalline, thank you for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Len, and it's a pleasure to be here. As Len mentioned, my focus is on defending and advising California employers, which I understand it may not necessarily be all of you, and especially with respect to this presentation, it's going to be focused on California. So apologies to the Nevada folks, but I understand that hopefully this will be helpful regardless of whether you are an employer or an employee, to educate you on your rights when it comes to COVID-19 and what workplaces should be doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we've seen, there's been a huge surge, and the question that employers have been scrambling to answer since the beginning of this pandemic is what do we do when an employee tests positive for COVID-19? And prior to that, there was guidance from the CDC. There may have been guidance from the state, also from your local county and city requirements that may have been imposed additionally. But now with that COVID has now unfortunately become some sort of a new norm, that of course California has stepped in to actually impose some legislation that governs employer responses in the event of COVID exposure in the workplace. And we can talk all day about COVID-19, but for purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to go over the three main developments, which is SB 1159, AB 685, and the Cal OSHA COVID-19 Emergency Temporary Standards. Next slide, please. And so the first legislation that came out, and this actually became active in September 2020, is Senate Bill 1159. And what that does is, and some of you may have heard before, but earlier in May, Governor Newsom had issued an executive order, which in essence created a presumption of workplace injury for workers' comp benefits if an employee tested for or was diagnosed with COVID within 14 days of working at their place of employment. And that, under the initial executive order, the presumption created under that executive order remained in effect for infections through July 5th. And so what SB 1159 does is that it in essence continued and expanded that presumption under the previous Governor Newsom's previous executive order. And that was actually signed September 17th and became and took place immediately. And so what that does is the extension now is extended to where if there is a presumption of entitlement to workers' comp benefits, if an employee tests positive for or receives a diagnosis within 14 days of working at a place of employment. The other clarification, though, for this presumption to apply is that it needs to occur during a period of outbreak. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of goes into more detail, but an outbreak is defined as under SB 1159 as 4 employee positives if your workplace has 100 employees or less. If you have more than 100 employees, then it's 4% of the number of your total employees. An outbreak can also be established if your local public health department or Cal OSHA comes and deems that it is there's an outbreak situation. And to clarify, the number 5 in California for at least employment is a magical number because if you have more than once you hit the 5 employee threshold, that subjects you to liability under the Fair Employment Housing Act for discrimination, harassment, and whatnot. That same 5 employee threshold is at play here for SB 1159. So that's good news for smaller employers, or at least ones who are operating under 4. But the next other, in addition to the presumption under SB 1159, that the other important requirement that it imposed was reporting obligations. And so what SB 1159 does is that it requires written notice to an employer's workers' comp claim administrator if the employer knows or reasonably should know that an employee has tested positive for COVID-19. And so, you know, among other things, that this notice to your workers' comp claim administrators needs to be in writing. It needs to disclose that an employee has tested positive, including the date, the address of where this employee was located, in addition to the highest number of employees who reported to work in the period of 45 days prior to the infection. Lastly, SB 1159 shortens the time frame in which to make a workers' compensation liability determination for COVID-19 cases from the typical 90 days to 45 or 30 days, depending on the type of employee. And failure to make this presumption, to timely make it, results in the application of the presumption. And you may be asking yourself, what are the penalties for failing to, meet these reporting requirements? It can be civil penalties of up to $10,000. So, pretty significant depending on, how the legislature interprets what constitutes a violation, if it's a one-time or multiple. So taking away this for best practices is that the good news is that this presumption of workers' comp benefits is disputable. And the statute specifically states that employers may dispute and rebut the application of the presumption by showing evidence of measures to reduce transmission of COVID-19. So that could be your social distancing policies, that could be providing PPE, staggering certain shifts. And so in addition to that, the employer can also rebut the presumption by establishing employees' non-occupational risk of COVID infection. So, for example, contact outside of the workplace. An example would be, in light of the Christmas holidays or the, just the holidays in general, that, perhaps someone may have, the employee may have contracted it at another gathering outside of the workplace. That all will be relevant to disputing and rebutting the application of this workers' compensation presumption. So what now? Since this has already been in effect since September 20th, 2020, make sure that you're creating reliable documented processes to comply with these reporting obligations. Also working closely with your workers' comp claims administrator and developing processes to investigate whether an employee's exposure was inside or outside of the workplace, so that you have some sort of evidence to help rebut and defend against these workers' comp claims. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the next development, which is AB 685. And AB 685 it applies to all employers, regardless of size. And it took place January 1, 2021. And so what AB 685 does is that it most notably requires written notice obligations on employers in the event of COVID exposure in the workplace. And so what that is written notice within 1 business day to all of your employees, employers of subcontracted employees. So that could include, staffing agencies, if you utilize them in your workplace, and employee representatives. So that could mean, union reps if your workplace is unionized in the event of COVID exposure. And if there's deemed an outbreak, which the state has defined as 3 or more cases at the same work site within a 14-day period, that then triggers additional reporting requirements to your local public health officials. And that would include your county and your state. And so these notices, in addition to the SB 1159, need to contain certain information with respect to, depending on who the notice is going to. But for the key requirements of notices to employees and their employee reps include just notifying that there was potential exposure in the workplace, providing information about any COVID-related benefits that the employer may offer or that are otherwise available to the employee, such as workers' comp or paid sick leave, the employer's response with respect to disinfection and further safety measures, And these notices, again, must be reasonably expected to reach employees within 1 business day of sending. And so what that means is it could be a text message, obviously text and email automated will be helpful, but for those workplaces who don't have work issued emails or, up-to-date contact information, it takes a little bit more creativity as far as getting these notices to employees within, 1 business day of sending. And so in addition, AB 685 has a second component that it pertains to Cal OSHA, but in essence, what it does is that previously, or, still with respect to Cal OSHA, that if Cal OSHA comes in and determines that there's going to be a serious violation, that employers are afforded a 15-day notice requirement before the citation is actually issued. What AB 685 does is that it eliminates that for serious violations that are specifically related to COVID. And with that same breadth, that Cal OSHA now under 685 has the authority to limit operations if it deems that there is an imminent hazard of COVID-19 infections. But so this took AB 685 took place took effect January 1, and so employers have had some time to anticipate its requirements. But if you haven't already, make sure that you have template communications that are ready to send in the event of different exposure. So for example, to your employees, and the content of your notice to employees may be different from the ones to employers of some subcontracted employees. Likewise, the requirements to notify your local public health will have a different content. So working with counsel or making sure that your notices are being sent in the right manner and contain everything that needs to be done to qualify under 685. Next slide, please. So that brings us to our last topic, and all of these you'll see will kind of overlap, and unfortunately not seamlessly, of course, under California, but the most recent, and it has been the most abrupt and I feel most impactful for employers, is the Cal OSHA COVID-19 emergency temporary standards. And what these are a set of standards that were proposed in early November and approved and went into effect November 30th, 2020. And they're currently in effect only for 180 days, so until the end of May, but it is subject to renewal. And with California, I would anticipate that it may be extended further. But what these temporary standards do is it's in essence a blend of everything. It's taking from the AB 685 notice requirements. It's taking from the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the paid sick leave under that component, and then also adds its nice touch to California of imposing even additional requirements in the event of COVID exposure in the workplace. And so fortunately, these standards, there are certain exceptions, and so that's employees covered under an aerosol transmission disease standards, which is typically most healthcare facilities or facilities pre-COVID that were requiring pretty extensive PPE, employees working from home, and then also employers with just one employee who really doesn't have contact with other persons, so someone who's working from home or whatnot. And so I've summarized them here. It's close to 20-page standards that were authored, but in essence, so before these standards, Cal OSHA had come out like the rest of everyone at California CDC with guidance that is changing, and it's always changing and evolving just as we learn more. But the initial guidance it authored was industry specific, and then also a guidance which arguably isn't enforceable. Our clients, some of them had received a surprise visit from Cal OSHA and had been hit with penalties on the basis of guidance only. But what these standards do is take away the uncertainty of whether guidance can be enforced. This provides the teeth, Cal OSHA, to really come after and enforce any violations with penalties. And so the main effects, I've listed them here, but one is establishing a written COVID-19 prevention program. And hopefully you've done this already if you haven't, but before these standards came out, Cal OSHA's guidance was, that all employers are expected to have an IIPP, an injury illness prevention program in place. And the guidance suggested that employers revise their IIPPs in order to specifically address COVID. And so what that could mean, again, was documenting your social distancing or any sort of efforts in the workplace to manage COVID and the spread. So now the standards establish written requirements for a separate COVID-19 specific prevention program. The good news is that that Cal OSHA has issued a sample, and so it's more of a fill in the blank. It is tedious. I have filled in one recently, but it's still nevertheless helpful that you have a sample template to go off of. The second requirement under Cal OSHA, which again overlaps from 685, is that providing that written notice again within 1 business day to your employees, employee reps, independent contractors. That's different from AB 685, and any employers during a high risk exposure period. So if I have someone who comes in and, well, let me take a step back. High risk exposure period under the standards is defined typically as 2 days prior to either the date of a test that an employee actually gets tested for COVID, not the results, or if there's symptoms involved, then 2 days before symptoms developed. So to the extent that you have an employee or anyone for that matter who steps into your work site during that what we deem to be high risk exposure period, where we traditionally understand that the individual is infectious, that would trigger this notice requirement, same as under AB 685. So the third one that also had employers raising their eyebrows was that, not to confuse everyone more, but Cal OSHA imposes its own standards of what an outbreak means. And so under these Cal OSHA standards, that an outbreak is defined, same as AB 685, as 3 or more cases in 14 days at a workplace. But there's also another component of major outbreak. And what that is that it's 20 or more cases in 30 days. And so in the event that an outbreak is triggered under Cal OSHA, that employers need to provide testing at no cost to employees during working hours. And that needs to be imposed immediately. And depending on the tier of the outbreak, it could be required once a week or up to 2 times a week thereafter. And while an employer is in the period of outbreak, of course, Cal OSHA doesn't give guidance on how this testing might be implemented, and which has a lot of my clients scratching their heads on how to reasonably implement this. But unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with here. So that's a major change as far as the standards, and nothing that we've ever seen like under the other California legislation that came out. And the fourth major requirement is requiring that an employer receive continued pay during a period of exclusion. And so prior to the implementation of these standards, and same with how I was advising my clients, that the CDC came out, and at the outset of COVID, everyone was taking it pretty seriously as far as work exposure. If I've been exposed to someone with COVID, then I'm going to be excluded from the workplace for 14 days, I think it was initially. CDC came back and said, if you're an essential worker, even if you're exposed in the workplace, that you can continue working as long as you self-monitor yourself for symptoms. So these standards take us back to the more conservative approach at the outset, that if I have any sort of workplace exposure or known exposure to COVID, that I am going to have to be excluded from the workplace for at least 10 days. And if you are excluded from the workplace because it's work-related exposure, then that triggers the employer's obligation to continue that employee's pay. So in essence, it's a paid sick leave, and there's no limit on it. And with the expiration of the emergency paid sick leave and the California supplemental paid sick leave in December, unfortunately, your employers aren't out of the woods with respect to COVID paid sick leave. So I've included some, again, these are 20, I'm running out of time, but there's 20 pages. I've highlighted the key ones here and included some links to helpful resources under Cal OSHA throughout this presentation. But next slide, please. And so we will make a copy of this available after the presentation, but I just wanted to quickly go over that. You're looking at, as far as violations, Cal OSHA those penalties can really add up. Also, we've mentioned workers' comp liability. You can be faced with fines and under state or local, or just an outright shutdown of your operations. So really make sure to work with your attorneys if you do, or designate a point person in your organization to monitor and implement this guidance, including, and that is a slew of sources, whether it be CDC, federal, state, Cal OSHA, so that you can stay on top of these, because this situation is constantly changing. Now we have some set standards, but just next slide, please. That brings us to the end. These are just 3 examples. If you have questions, again, I'm happy to go over those. And I've included a link to, again, just all of the sources in addition to our firm's COVID Task Force Resource Center, which includes not just employment developments, but all sorts of practice groups within our firm that are addressing COVID-related issues, including the vaccine that will be coming up and hopefully we can talk about later. But thank you again for having me, and I will turn it back to Len and Tom.
Thank you, Crystalline. We've talked about, even under good times, if you will, the difficulties of being a California employer with all the puts and takes, and this certainly does add to it. So this is a tremendous amount of information, and for everyone, we will post these. We will post this on both of our websites, Southern California and Northern California PGA. So, Crystalline, the question, the SB 59 in effect in September, and then the Cal OSHA requirements in effect in November, and particularly at SB 59 with the presumption being disputable. Have any cases come up? Have any fines been implemented, and have they been challenged by any of the employers, or is it too early for that?
So SB 1159, I haven't seen it enforced. I don't anticipate too much noise under that one, since there was already the impact of the executive order to sit in. But actually, it's funny that you say that, because another counsel that we're working with had mentioned that there was a case in San Francisco where the Cal OSHA standards have been challenged already. And so, unfortunately, it's I think by the time that there's resolution on that the standards arguably are going to expire by the end of May. But certainly with respect to enforcement, as you were mentioning, I personally, one of our clients were dealing with Cal OSHA, who had done a surprise inspection and hit them with certain penalties with respect to COVID. So it is a real thing. What are the chances that someone, Cal OSHA is going to come knock on your door? you have to be willing to take that gamble, but it is being actively enforced, and I think we can expect that too with the new administration that's coming in.
Okay, thank you, Kristin. Yeah, and we should approach it that way. As you mentioned, we should approach the fact that there is a possibility that we may get the knock on the door. And in our case, we actually are keeping our doors locked. So as a little bit of safety too. So Kristin, thank you so much. And I hope you can join us for the rest of our session this morning. Again, we will have all the information posted on both of our websites. And we look forward, Kristin, to continuing our conversation with you as we navigate this together.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristin.
Okay, now I'd like to turn it over to our Northern California PGA section member, Greg Raleigh. Greg has been a section member for quite a while and is a financial advisor with the firm of Waddle & Reed in Reno. And Greg has been with us earlier in the year, as mentioned previously. And as we move towards the second round of the payroll protection program, and one of the major differences for us is that this round does include 501c6 organizations. The PGA of America is a 501c6. The sections of the PGA of America are 501c6 corporations, as well as probably most chambers of commerce around the country and the regional golf associations, which certainly provided some input for the inclusion of the 501c6s within the program. I understand the 501c7s, which is the designation of most of the private clubs around the country, are still excluded at this point. So also to talk about the changes, Greg, from the first rollout to the second rollout and what's coming and what's not coming. Again, thank you, Greg. Happy New Year. Glad you're with us. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you. All right. Okay. Okay, sounds like Greg is having a little bit of an audio issue. Let's see if we can log back in. And I'll give it just a moment. Okay, as we look to get Greg back online, let's see if we can jump to Craig Kessler, Director of Government Affairs for the Southern California Golf Association. Craig?
Okay, I'll try to fill a little bit of the dead time. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. Let me preface my remarks by probably reiterating some things that all of you know because you watch the news and you read the newspapers. Things aren't looking too good in this state for COVID-19 cases, much worse in Los Angeles County than the rest of the counties in the state. 4 of the 5 regions are under the governor's regional stay-at-home order. All the prescriptions they're under. That's a process. He announced that on December 2nd. Within 48 hours, San Joaquin, central part of the state, 11 counties. Okay. I'm getting a lot of echo, but not anymore. I apologize for that. And of course, Southern California's 11 counties that are in that region are under the stay-at-home order. I'll get in a moment what that generally means for golf, but suffice it to say, for that right now in Los Angeles County, the public hospitals and most of the private hospitals are preparing triage plans, which means they're developing protocols for exactly who arrives in their emergency room, who they will not treat, and who they will treat. And I open with this to indicate how desperate it is and how bad those caseloads are, not to indicate how important it is necessarily to follow the rules. I'll get to that in a moment, but to indicate that even though I've been predicting, and I'll continue to predict, that golf, a form of recreational golf, as I'll explain in a second, should continue throughout the duration as things get worse before they get better, and they will get worse. There is a possibility, at least in the state's largest county, that there could be some kind of literal, for a couple of week period, in order to protect the integrity of the public health system, some kind of absolute stoppage, which isn't going to make distinctions among those activities like golf that are genuinely safe and those that are not. There won't be the time, and we'll be in those kinds of emergency circumstances. Having said all that, generally under those regional stay-at-home orders, even though the language therein speaks in terms of golf permitted and a number of other outdoor recreational activities as on an individual or household basis, that has been universally interpreted. The individuals does not mean singles. Literally it does, but the way it's come down to be interpreted is that it means individuals in groups of no more than 4 playing in prior reservations no less than 10 minutes apart, which is the way we've been playing golf. All the common touch points, the rakes, the pool noodles, the flag sticks, the ball washers, the drinking fountains, the clubhouses, everything else, of course, remain back to where we were at the beginning of this pandemic, strictly off limits. There is a food and beverage function, particularly if it's independent of the golf operation that operates under the protocols for restaurants, which is grab and go or takeout. And with no seating, no ability, literally grab and go. So I suppose you can take it on the golf course or you can take it home with you out on the way to the parking lot. I think that type of golf will continue. To those who continually write many of us emails to suggest that there should be further relaxations that may make some sense and may be perfectly safe, let me suggest that you're correct, but the timing couldn't be worse. And the appetite for dealing with those things among public health officials, like I said at the beginning, who are literally trying to develop protocols that make decisions which takes a little bit of pressure off of hospital administrators and physicians to decide literally who lives and dies, because we only have so much bandwidth. Keep that in mind when we're speaking about golf and put it into that perspective. I know everyone on this call regards it as paramount, but it's not paramount to those making these life and death decisions. What I had, obviously I've given, put out a lot of information from the SCGA, and we run a seminar, actually a webinar yesterday with the Southern California PGA section, and some of the material that Caitlin developed earlier and that Greg was going to present before I spoke is some of the material that we covered, although in less detail than they were going to cover it. I'm not going to be redundant with that. But what I am going to share with you is something that I have found that we, in our rush to play golf and in our exuberance a little bit about the fact that golf has been extraordinarily successful during the pandemic and continues to be extraordinarily successful. The numbers are through the roof. There's a little bit of a storm cloud on that horizon, because the very thing that makes golf, as I've used that phrase, and some people have made a little fun of it, peculiarly amenable to life during a pandemic, is the exact same feature of our game that was causing us the greatest grief just before March of 2020, and is going to continue to cause us grief. And in fact, I would say increasingly, rapidly accelerating grief once we come out of this pandemic. And we're going to come out of the pandemic. This is not a permanent situation. And we all hope the shorter of the better. And it's this. And this is the statistics I worked out because I needed to find ways during the pandemic to communicate to public health officials that have very little toleration for dealing with golf. But I'm a pushy guy, so we force them, and so is Tom, and so is Len, and so are the rest of us. So we've forced ourselves to be listened to at times. And I'm happy to report that in most instances, they really did listen to us, and we should be grateful for that. And that when you look at those rules I just explained, groups of 4 in reservations no less than 10 minutes apart, if you take the average size of a golf course, at least in the Southern California area, what you end up with is a ratio that's slightly misleading, and I'll go into that. But in essence, it's 1.3 persons on a golf course maxed out under current rules per 1 acre of open space. And if you think about that, there is no other recreational activity outdoors that has that much capacity to practice social distancing. Now, in using that statistic, I've been occasionally taken to task for stating that it sounds like I'm saying that we have 1 golfer in one or one and a third golfers. I don't know how you get a third of a person in 1 acre. No, you have 4 persons who are moving through that acreage at a 1.3 ratio to the acreage, together. But if 4 people can't keep socially distanced over a golf hole they have to themselves in the wide open air, shame on them. It's quite a bit easier to do that than it is anywhere else. And that ratio is guaranteed because unlike a park or unlike a lot of other outdoor recreational activities, which can become rather crowded, there's no controls over a park. There's controls over golf courses because, as everyone on this call knows, we charge people real money to play them, which means that it's natural for them to be regulated that way, and they're regulated by a cash register protocol or a debit card protocol at this particular point, so that we can guarantee, and I've used that to speak in shorthand to public health officials to underscore just how amenable golf is to the social distancing and the common touch point control necessary to be safe under COVID-19. But if you think about it a moment, that is exactly what is our greatest existential problem as a game. We put far too few people, and all of them are golfers. They're not soccer players. They're not general public looking to just walk in nature, on way too much acreage in an era in urban environments in which the competition for land is fierce, and it's getting fiercer every day. That competition is from, now if it's in the municipal sector, where we have a Park Preservation Act, which can be amended at any time, and I'll get to that in a moment, that prevents the repurposing of any park land for commercial or residential development, in other words, making money. Still, the pressure from little leagues, AYSO soccer, from just those members of the population that look at a golf course with the fences around and say, I don't play golf, but I'm, as a member of the public, I own this municipal course. And by the way, more than 1 out of 5 golf courses in California are municipally owned. It's about 23%. When they say those things, and that pressure goes to open it up to a much greater percentage of the population. So again, think back to that statistic. We are so thrilled that in this particular moment in time, we put 1.3 persons per 1 acre, but that statistic is out there and that statistic is known. And that makes us, that puts even additional political pressure on the maintenance of those facilities. And the same applies, and for those who want to rely upon the Park Preservation Act, remember, those who read these reports very carefully and pay attention to it, recall that a couple of years ago, there was an LA area assemblywoman who did float a bill that would have amended the Park Preservation Act to add to the exceptions. Right now, the exceptions are a police station, a fire station, or a major highway. In other words, the things that are subject of condemnation proceedings. And it would have added as she put it in her preamble, to turn those useless public golf courses in my district into valuable sites for affordable housing. And anyone who who lives in the state who doesn't recognize the problem in affordable housing, and anyone who lives in any one of the cities who doesn't recognize the burgeoning homelessness problem, just isn't paying very close attention. But then again, in the pandemic, we're all asked to stay at home, so it's hard to pay attention to some of these things. So those pressure that in the municipal sector. And for those who feel that, well, what about the daily fee sector and particularly the private sector? The pressures are the same, it's just the results are differences. There's a reason why in our state's largest city, there is one and only one daily fee golf course within it. And it's in a flood control plain that can't otherwise be developed for anything. And it's on the fringe of that city. That city is Los Angeles. Everything is basically a private club, private equity club, or a municipal golf course. And once upon a time, the city of Los Angeles, the greatest species of golf course was the daily fee golf course. But as time moves on and there are higher and better uses of property and land, golf becomes a rather foolish proposition if you own that property. We have to keep that in mind, that those pressures ramp up over time. And for the private clubs, yeah, they can't take your property away from you. But I think all of you remember Prop 15, which would have changed the property tax paradigm in California. It would not have badly hurt. It would not have hurt private golf clubs in a way that it certainly would have hurt overtly commercial property. And again, the California Alliance for Golf and the SCGA were very careful to point that out. So our private clubs didn't get carried away getting themselves enmeshed in the political controversy that the better part of wisdom was to avoid. Nonetheless, still, as the pressures on property exist, it isn't a far cry, and I know that those things are being thought of all the time, to simply ask that those who can afford that wide open space privately in whether it's in San Francisco or San Diego or Los Angeles or Oakland, or San Jose for that matter, that they pay a much higher privilege, pay a lot more into the common purse for that privilege. So there's a whole host of pressures that revolve around that statistic of 1.3 to 1 that we're lauding so much right now, but we need to start preparing as we hope to keep as much of that COVID-19 bounty that the games received during the crisis, that we recognize that very thing which benefited us at this moment is the thing that's going to continue to cause us the greatest problems. What I'm about to say, I've said in a lot of other forums, and maybe I'll preface it by saying that perhaps I had cops' view of the universe. Cops see problems that's all they see because that's their life every day. But I would suggest to everyone, if you could see what I see every day, what I read every day, what I hear every day, what I research every day, and what I'm confronted with every day, everything revolves back to that issue that golf puts too few people on way too much property. And we haven't paid close enough attention to the virtues of that property and the kinds of ways it contributes to society and the way in which it contributes to communities, because we are always going to be made vulnerable at one point or another to the reality, and it's a fact, that we dedicated 100+ acres that everyone wants to get their hands on, and the public owns in 22% of the cases in the state, to too few persons, and all those persons simply play golf. That's our greatest challenge moving forward. That's a little bit longer term. If you could read what I read and see what I see and all the rest, you'd also recognize that many of those who covet our property and quite honestly finance the invasion of it, they are well organized, they're well established, and they are well funded. And we are not. We are disparate, we're balkanized. The California Alliance for Golf has developed a good stability and a good record and the good skeleton of that kind of effort, but it's going to have to be ramped up in fairly short order if we can expect. I mean, one of the saddest things would be to see all this demand in the game, because COVID-19 has kind of reminded everyone why golf's been popular for 500 years. It provides certain things that other activities just don't, and some of those are, again, amenable to life during a pandemic. But having brought a lot of occasional golfers and made them more avid golfers, and a lot of non-golfers and introduced them to the game, yes, I'm optimistic that many of the people on this call are going to be on the front lines of keeping them in the game. But you know, you can't, it's hard to grow something when you don't have anywhere to grow it. My frustration is the golf industry likes to talk a lot about market capitalism and all the rest of it. We are not like other industries. We're not an auto factory that can close down one line or lay people off. We can't contract and then expand again. We're not sectors like the restaurant sector is always extraordinarily volatile, and right now it's been destroyed. But all those little places will come back. There'll be new entities, new corporations, new restaurateurs. But if you think about it a moment, with the amount of property necessary, with the development costs, we talk about just the cost of paying the water bills at these courses in California, but are so extraordinary that every facility that gets lost, that gets repurposed in the private sector because somebody owns it and can make a whole lot more money developing it and they can't operating a golf course, or whether it's in the public sector where suddenly the public clamors and wants other uses that can be used by more members of the community, by a greater percent of the population, whatever that is. Once we shrink, we can't, with the exploding demand, where are we going to put them all? And those are the kinds of things that strike me, and I'm sharing them with you on this particular broadcast, and I'm probably going to be sharing with a lot of people here in the coming months, because I'm in that position where maybe I see that a little bit more clearly. Maybe I have the luxury, or more accurately, the job of seeing those things more clearly and communicating them, whereas everybody else is just trying to figure out the employee rules, the OSHA rules, how do I get a forgivable PP loan? How do I open up tomorrow? What are the requirements? How do I get through the next quarter? What am I going to do? And I recognize that difference. So I'm using this opportunity today. We're at the dawn of a new year to hearken back to some of the greater things that we have to also pay attention to the longer term, or some of these short term exigencies will come to naught. So that was probably not the level of detail that you were looking for, but we have some other people on this broadcast today that are much more expert in some of that relevant detail, and I determined to leave it to them. And I'm going to guess that one of those experts, Greg Raleigh, is probably ready to go. So I should relinquish the floor, see if there are any questions, and then listen to the detail he's going to present to us. As always, thanks for having me on the broadcast. It's always a pleasure.
So Craig, thank you. And you know what I took from that very strongly was heed the warning. So Craig, do you feel, obviously you do, but it's almost imminent perhaps that when we're through COVID, expect this quote unquote land use attack? We've been through this before. You know, there was the taxation possibility years ago of member dues, of giving lessons and such. And then again, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, right here, Sharp Park in Pacifica was under tremendous threat. As you said, the opponents are very well funded, very well organized. And that was, fortunately, we had Richard Harris and Bo Links leading the charge to turn that away. So it sounded pretty serious, Craig, as you described that. Do you feel there's been an uptick in that? And again, that we should expect this to come back when we're past COVID?
It's occurring right now. Kevin Fitzgerald and I are involved in multiple such examples, and each one of them presents a unique set of dynamics, unique communities. We're, at least in the southern part of the state, and of course in San Francisco with the Public Golf Alliance, on the ground, involved, and can kind of assess these situations and to the greatest degree possible. And sometimes that degree is zero. In one case in Orange County, it is. And but there's at least 6 that we're involved in right now. And we can see more on the horizon. One of the things that's probably put it a little bit on hold is everything's on hold during COVID-19, but it's something that's been coming. And the fact, it's probably occurring in parts of the state where we're not on the ground, and we're it. I mean, we're about the only organizing force that's even addressing these things. because our golfers on the ground just don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the savvy, and they don't really, except again, except for the SCGA in Southern California, they don't have anyone to come in from big nature and actually help them out. And they're often against groups like Land for Public Trust, which has millions of dollars for the effort. And some of those millions are from public sources, by the way, which is particularly aggravating. And again, they have donor networks, and they have organizing networks, and they have staff people, and I think many people listening don't see it. You maybe read the headline that something closed, but that process was underway a long time. And I'm not talking about those maybe poorly run or poorly reinvested golf facilities in those parts of the state that got overbuilt. That's a separate situation. I'm talking about instances of very successful municipal golf courses that are returning profits to their government, and we've gotten to the point now where the population is no longer impressed with that. They're prepared to spend their own money to do other things with it, or situations in which a land conservancy group or a public trust is willing to pay more money to buy the thing out than the golf course is developing. So we get sort of outbid on that nature. And again, I focus a lot. I think it has repercussions all the way to the top in terms of the property tax jeopardy for private golf clubs. But at the bottom level, I keep focusing. I don't want to call it the bottom level. At the municipal level, it's because I stated the statistic that 22% of the golf courses in the state are municipally owned, but over 40% of golf played in the state are on those 22% of the golf courses, and roughly 90% of all the Grow the Game programs, all the First Tee programs, all the Youth on Course program, the SCGA Junior Golf Foundation program, all the local programs that I think golf should really be proud of all those things that we do. Over 90% of them are on those golf courses, and they're disproportionately on the little developmental courses that have always struggled financially. But we once upon a time lived in an era in which the policymakers and even the general public thought that along with soccer fields and baseball diamonds and beaches and all the rest of the things that we spend tax money to support every year, they used to think it was important as part of the eco-structure of greater golf programs that might make money in some places, but needed to have sort of lost leaders to generate that. There's no toleration for that anymore. And part of that problem is that we, being the great beneficiaries of it, never focused much attention, never paid attention to the fact that maybe one day the appetite for supporting those things with public largesse would go away, and what would we be left with? And that's kind of the situation that we're in right now. We have a lot of lost time to make up for, and you can never really do that. And saying that's a hackneyed saying. I'm probably the 9 millionth person to say it. The best time to have done something is always in the past, and the second best time would be now. So I guess that's my plea right here on this call. Now would be the time to begin dealing with these things. Okay, I'm done. I'm off my soapbox now.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you so much. And so we will keep our diligence on the front line. And again, we're so grateful for you and Kevin for keeping us aware of what's happening and what we need to be prepared for. So at this time, I'd like to reintroduce our good friend, Greg Raleigh, and to talk to us about round 2 of the stimulus package, and specifically the payment protection program and other relevant issues. So Greg, thank you, and glad you're with us this morning.
Good morning, Len. Good morning, Tom. Can you hear me now?
We can. Yeah.
All right. We will overcome technical difficulties. Well, good morning, everybody. Yes, on December 28th, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which included in it the second round of the Paycheck Protection Program. Full disclosure on this phone call this morning, the program hasn't rolled out yet. So what I'm sharing with you this morning is a collection of what my peers in California are hearing, finding, uncovering on both the legal side, my attorney friends, as well as my financial friends and other contacts. The other topic that I'm going to get into a little bit this morning that I uncovered in the last hour and a half from another peer in California is that there's actually a California relief grant through California Small Business Development. I sent the link over to Len. If you could have you or Nikki attach that to the what people can see here on this presentation, that there's another opportunity for California small business to pick up a little extra, for lack of a better term, free money potentially. And we'll go into both of those this morning. A little bit about the highlights of the second round of PPP. You've got, well, full disclosure, the SBA has not put it out on their website yet. Legally, they had 10 days from the passing, which would be today, or actually yesterday. Still don't see anything on the SBA.gov. You're as welcome to go there as I am. So log on to SBA.gov, and you'll see right on their homepage they've got a link to the coronavirus PPP programs, and nothing is updated there yet. But what we found in reading through the bill itself is that there's a little more. The second round is a little more quantitatively defined with regard to what you need to have experienced in your business to apply for the second round, which would be 1 quarter between 2019 and 2020 of 25% down business. I see this as an opportunity for a lot of golf professionals, as most likely, and I would guess that you experienced in either quarter 1 or quarter 2 a massive downturn last year, talking to most of my friends in the business, and then in quarter 3 you probably had a massive upturn. Well, based on what we're seeing, that's probably not going to disqualify you from that, because you had at least 1 quarter of 25% down. So as this comes out, I would encourage those who have that experience to go ahead and apply. That gets into the second question, which is, where do I apply? We don't know yet. That guidance has not come out yet, but I would probably go back to the first source that most of you applied for it the first time. I would go back to someone's to that source. If you didn't apply for it the first time, the answer is I don't know. The way the bill reads is it reads as if it's supposed to be helping those who applied the first time, but talking to some of my attorney friends, that is not clear yet. So we'll have to see when that comes out. In terms of who can apply, Len touched on it earlier. There are some nonprofit organizations who, the 501c6s, the associations and so forth, who can apply. It doesn't look like the 501c7s are available quite yet on this go round. And so as far as that's concerned, that's the best guidance I can give you there. With regard to what you can apply for that's forgivable, it's very similar to the first go round with regard to 2.5 times your payroll. And you'll have to talk to your tax person what they define payroll, and then once all that comes out. But that's essentially, they were trying to give out a very similar amount that they did in the first go around to those who had were adversely impacted economically, with a little bit more definition of what that means on this go round. So that kind of wraps up on the PPP second round. With regard to what I found on the California Relief Grant, just really quick, looks like, because I'm not in California, I'm sorry I haven't got it to you sooner. This is for California specific only, and I'm in Nevada. But there is a sense of urgency on that one. It looks like the grants have to be applied for by January 13th, 2021. And looking at the slide, there's actually, it says View Application Guide on the homepage. On that PowerPoint presentation, it's opportunities for grants to be awarded. So if your gross revenue is between $1,000 and $100,000, you could apply for a $5,000 grant. If your gross revenue is between $100,000 and $1 million, you can apply for a $15,000 grant. And if your gross revenue is between $1 million and $2.5 million, you can apply for a $25,000 grant. That's just the quick takeaway on that. I don't have much more information. You'll have to kind of dig into that and use some other resources, as I have not gotten up the curve there, not being in California myself. That kind of gets us to the end of what I had for you this morning. Len, do you want to open this up? Do you have questions? How do you want to go from here?
Okay, Greg, I don't, let me check for questions. I don't necessarily see any from there. I will say that with the California small business that you just talked about, Greg, yeah, the applications initially did open on December 30, and the original applications were due by January 8th, and that has been, as you mentioned, moved to January 13th. So probably to no surprise, there was some overwhelming, the website was overwhelmed and the processing was overwhelmed and such. So please keep in mind, everyone, take a look, and there on the screen, you see the highlights of the program noting the January 13 deadline, which is next Wednesday. So Greg, you know, many times we ask the question and there's no answer yet, but and on the rollout, as you mentioned, is it a week, 2 weeks, a month, or any good guess on that at all?
Are you talking specifically on the PPP program? Yeah, the answer is I don't know yet. Once it hits the site, we'll know a lot more. But we learned on the first go around not to assume anything, and based on, regardless of what you read in the bill itself, may not be perfectly reflected in practice. So this is our second go around. We've learned a little bit from the first go around.
Okay, great, Greg. So I think it would be safe to say that, based upon our experience, that when the answers come out, we'll have more questions for sure.
Right. We'll be back doing this again next week, probably with a lot more information, is what I would guess.
Great. Greg, thank you for keeping us updated, and also your willingness to stay with us as the weeks go on and we learn more and the process becomes a little more finite, a little more definite, a little more accurate. So let me just check with Nikki. Caitlin, any questions for Greg?
I don't see any at this time, Lynn.
Okay, Nikki, thank you very much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that was a lot this morning on the, if you would, legislative side, on the financial side. And so thank you for being with us. And we'll talk a little bit about what's coming up next week. But at this time, as we start to wrap, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Addis in Southern California. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Len, and thanks everybody, and thanks to Greg and Crystalline and Craig, as usual, Kevin and everybody for this great information. This is information that you could count on going into the future, starting with next week. And Len's going to tell you a little bit about what we have next week and ensuing weeks. So we will attempt to bring you presentations that will keep you up to date to the minute, and that is our goal, and you can count on that, and we look forward to doing that and look forward to next week. And thanks everybody. Thanks again to Tony. Tony, thank you, and on behalf of our president, Robin Shelton, who will be with us next week, and of course thanks again to Nikki and Bryce and Caitlin and everybody, and for their hard work on this program. So thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you, Tom. And President Moriarty did have to leave as well. So for next week, we'll be an hour earlier. First thing next week on Friday, January 15th, we will be starting at 9 a.m. And we have our guests from the East Coast, and that change in the time is to accommodate them, but we're grateful that they will be with us. We have Seth Waugh, the Chief Executive Officer of the PGA of America. And at this time, we also have Dr. David Hamer, who's a board-certified infectious disease expert, to guide us through everything that's happening with COVID now, and with the disease, with the vaccines rolling out. And then there's been a lot of press about the variants of COVID-19. So we're grateful to have Seth, and certainly grateful to have Dr. Hamer with us next week. So please keep in mind, you'll see that as we put out the notices during the week, that we are starting at 9 a.m. next week, and to accommodate their schedule. So again, as we said, everybody be safe, continue doing what you're doing, being with family and friends as possible and safe, and continuing on as we learn how to navigate the continuation of COVID-19. So enjoy the weekend. Thank you for being with us. Again, your comments and suggestions are always welcome, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.